further ado, I'm going to actually call upon the Prime Minister to open up this meeting this afternoon.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. We'll get right to the point. This House believes that naturalized immigrants, naturalized citizens, should be eligible to run for and hold the office of the President of the United States. Currently, the Constitution dictates that someone born outside of the United States can run for but cannot hold that office. It's a constitutional relic initially put into the Constitution to prevent United Empire loyalists from running for the presidency immediately after the American Revolution, and we think that it's no longer valid. We now say that anyone who has become a citizen of the United States should be eligible to run for the office of president. And we have a couple of things to say on that. I'm going to talk first of all about how democracy should be a meritocracy, and anyone who has the qualifications to be president should be allowed to run, or should be allowed to hold the office. Second of all, I'm going to talk about how it's discriminatory. First of all, on a pragmatic level, in a way that actually affects people who would otherwise be running for the presidency and the quality of American politics. And second of all, on a philosophical level, about the way that it affects America in a philosophical and normative sense, and the way that it affects American society. And the vast majority of Americans will not actually run for the presidency. If I have time, I will talk about the importance of citizenship as an alternate test, a superior test of valid eligibility, rather than being born in the United States. If I don't have time, Andrew's going to cover it. Actually, Andrew will be covering everything today. Okay, so first, yes.
So, if you're born in a high-risk country, you're never be able to take a highly sensitive security job. We think this is just
like, we don't think that that's actually a valid reason to deny people high-risk security jobs. We think this is actually sort of like distinct from a high-risk security job. We think that like the IPOC wants to make the argument that people who come from so-called high-risk countries we can simply assume to be at high risk of doing bad things when they're president. First of all, we said the president is kept in check by things like the Constitution and the other two branches of government and having to be responsive to an American electorate. Because of the idea people like worm their way in, take the citizenship test, become citizens, and like dedicate significant portions of their lives just to running for president, just to do bad things is not valid. Okay? Like, well, I'm going to cover that a bit more. So the first point of his is about how democracy should be a meritocratic process, right? We think it's really straightforward. People elect their leaders, and anyone who has the wherewithal, like the intelligence and the qualities to become president, or who can persuade the electorate that they have those qualities, anyone who has that dedication can be a good president. And there's no bona fide reason why someone who just happens to be born outside of the United States cannot possess those qualities, right? So this is the epitome of discrimination in that we are barring people from holding a post, no thank you, based on an immutable characteristic. And we think that's inherently wrong. We think that allowing people to run makes the world a better place, and on that basis, I think this case wins, right? We think also that currently people who live in like the protectorates of the United States, like Guam and places like that, despite being citizens, can't even run for the presidency. We also think there are loopholes in that you can be born in the United States, then move to a different country, live there for a long period of time, like majority of your life even, and then move back and run for the presidency. Well, a very good example is Barack Obama, right? Because he spent a large portion of his childhood in Indonesia, came back. Voters were able to evaluate for themselves whether or not the fact that he had lived in a different country and done some schooling in an Islamic school, like, made him a good or bad candidate for the presidency. So that evaluation didn't have to be based on whether he was actually born in the United States or not. We get more on that later. But the point is that voters can make that evaluation, and in fact, thus far, Barack Obama has not transformed the United States into some kind of like Muslim dictatorship. And we see that he's actually as loyal to the United States and as capable of being a good leader as anyone who happened to be born on American soil. So we think that invalidates the idea of birthplace as a criterion. We think it's inherently racist and wrong to say that just the country that you have to be born in dictates whether or not you can leave. Second of all, or like as 2.7, I want to talk about how this is discriminatory in two ways. So first of all, pragmatically, there are people who have dedicated long lives of public service to like the American political system and who can make excellent presidential candidates currently being denied that opportunity. A few people we can talk about like Madeleine Albright, or like the highest, like one of the foreigners who held one of the highest posts ever held by a former Secretary of State, but who did, despite her high intelligence and long dedication to American politics, could never be president, despite her immense qualifications, simply because of being a foreigner by birth. Henry Kissinger, whatever you might think of him, is another example of someone who dedicated a lot of public service to America. We think that like, Ben Granholm, the governor of Michigan, who's immensely popular, was born in Canada and moved to the United States at the age of 6. Like, barely probably remembers her time in Canada, has lived her entire life in the United States, is immensely popular, and probably someone who would otherwise put their name forward for the presidency, but is denied that opportunity. We say that if people want to come and dedicate themselves to a life We are stupid and discriminatory by throwing away that rightness and that potential. We think we're limiting the potential for the presidential candidates, as well as being discriminatory in the general sense. We think that all of that is bad. Like John McCain was born in Panama and was only able to run for the presidency basically because his father is an admiral, and they were able to find ways to sort of loop around this particular provision. The fact that they felt they had to do that people then still voted for John McCain anyway, and that people felt they had to get around this law and could, just simply means that the law is inherently acknowledged by many people to be stupid and should be gotten law. Constitutional provision should be gotten rid of. Right? Second of all, on a more philosophical level, I think we can say that we say on side government that what makes you American, it's particularly true in the United States, what makes you an American is not whether you were physically born in the United States. It's not physically where you're born, right? Especially in America, which is founded in the idea of openness in immigration. What makes you an American is the fact that you've chosen to come to America in many cases, to be an American, to dedicate yourself to the American way of life, or to live your life in the way that you see fit, right? We should be saying to people who immigrate to the United States that the American dream is the ideal that says that you can go from the bottom of society to the top, that you can work your way all the way up, right? We think that if someone has chosen, we think that someone who moves to America can everything be more American, be more of a patriotic citizen than someone who by accident of birth is handed eligibility for running for the presidency in this way, right? Someone who has chosen to give up their old life, who embraces American ideals to the extent that they've moved and taken in the work to become a citizen, should be rewarded with the opportunity to lead. We think it's contradictory to say, you're a citizen, you have money rights, you have the right to vote, you have the right to choose your leaders, you don't have the right to nominate yourself as leader. We think that that's contradictory and wrong. We're enshrining the idea that immigrants are inherently different and inherently alien. We think that is pragmatic feedback, right? We think that for immigrants who move to the United States and see people saying that because Barack Obama was supposedly born abroad, that means he should not be the president. Whatever the validity of that argument, we don't think it has any. The point is that when immigrants particularly see people making these claims, they see that in the Constitution is enshrined a law which is an expression of that basically xenophobic sentiment that says that people who are born elsewhere are different than others. And seeing those people every day saying, he's an immigrant, he's no good, you're an immigrant, you're inherently non-American, you're always alien, you can't truly become fully part of American culture and American politics, is bad. We don't think that immigrants should be subjected to that. We think that it's alienating, and it's not necessary to achieve more integrated society. Right? So because that's pragmatically a harm to immigrants, because that's basically oppressive, and it's discrimination that we don't think has any real basis, and has no bona fide justification, we think that it's inherently wrong. That's what we're very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Secretary for his remarks. I'll call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open up this debate for opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have three constructive arguments. First thing I'm going to talk about security. Secondly, I'm going to talk about your rights as an immigrant and what exactly you are entitled to. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about just the reaction on a practical level from the American people were this case to ever actually be developed. But on security, so Sophie and I would take as a basic premise that Americans and Canadians and most Western nations in general are actually willing to be quite discriminatory when it comes to matters of national security. So as an example, if you work for Lockheed Martin, just the fact that you were born in a country such as China or a country such as India is sufficient to disqualify you from working on a project such as building an engine for a fighter jet. And what that means, practically speaking, then, is that the government is perfectly willing to say that in issues where people might be put at risk, those immutable characteristics which we can never, there is no actual way to disprove of that risk, we are willing to take the safe side, right? So in matters of liberty and security, that's where we draw the line. Why do we think this matters to the American presidency? Because recognize the president actually in some cases is more than a figurehead and wields real power as the executive branch of the American system. And in particular, I think when they say that the checks and balances upon the executive will work to curtail a malicious person in charge, I think the last presidency actually amply shows that when a president is sought to overstep the bounds of what is acceptable on the minds of the American people, the checks and balances promised by the courts and by the legislatures are insufficient in contrast to the power of the single person at the head of the state. Go ahead.
So are you actually saying that people will try to move to the United States, become citizens, infiltrate a political party, become the president, and then give away sensitive information?
I think it is this to the same extent that it is possible that like someone, just because they were born in China, is at a higher risk of divulging like the state secrets of a fighter jet engine, that person is to the same extent not eligible to hold the highest state secrets deemed to you that you ought to possess by the American presidency. So yes, that is the point. We're saying it is likely that it could happen, and it's sufficient for us to have it. Secondly, I want to talk about your rights as an immigrant. We do recognize that this is an immutable characteristic, but we would also put to you that because you are someone who is allowed into the country by the United States of America, it is actually legitimate, and we recognize legitimate, to make somewhat arbitrary choices on what people who immigrate to the United States are allowed to do. So on a very basic level, the United States picks and chooses who is allowed to come into the country. If you were born in a different country, you had no right to move to the United States in the first place. We make arbitrary choices based on whether your family members lived in the United States, no matter what it was in particular that you yourself possessed as your skills. If you were born in Afghanistan and you had no valid birth certificate, it is very likely that you will never be allowed to move to the United States. And we are drawing that line purely based on the fact that as a nation, our interests come first and foremost when we distinguish between who we want to allow into the country and not allow into the country. And to the same extent that we choose who comes into the country, we can also choose what jobs those people are allowed to do in order to keep the United States safe. Go.
Don't we lose that moral right once we let people in? Once we say you are allowed to be a citizen, once we give them that right, don't we lose the ability to impose any future limitations on what they want to do?
So I think actually they stand for a world, right? I think implicitly they're saying you shouldn't have things like national security considerations, right? I think they're also kind of saying you shouldn't have restrictions on state secrets just based on where you're born. I think Sophie and I stand for a better world in which we allow for a compromise and a middle ground, because I think in their world, Americans would simply see it as unreasonable and unacceptable to allow people into the country who are able to trustworthily do some jobs, but not able to do the full gamut of jobs that require the full trust of the American people. I think it's better to draw this line so that we can allow this type of immigration to happen. Thank you. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the reaction on the part of the American people. I would actually contest their example of Barack Obama as one where like people were able to gain the trust of him even though he was sort of grew up outside of the country, because even though he was born as an American citizen, I think we basically trust him because of his roots in the United States. There's nonetheless the fact that like the political system is majorly fucked up because people think that he's a Muslim and he was born in Indonesia. So like that's just a suspicion, right? And it's already led to the creation of basically a movement. We think like were that actually to be the case genuinely, and it not just be people making shit up, the American people would similarly be unwilling to fully trust and participate in a vital political process. That is how they deal with challenges. That's how they respond to challenges on American security. So what did we hear about from the side? So the first thing they talked about was some practical concerns about like where we ought to draw the lines, places like Guam, right? So I think the reason that we draw this line is because like even though they're a principality, they're probably not integrated into the rest of the United States in the way they're governed to the same extent. So if we needed to like redraw the line in marginal cases, Sophie and I are probably okay with examining that. It's certainly not a reason why you ought to like apply this case to the entire world. The second thing they talked about was that practically there are people who are very talented who cannot achieve the American presidency despite this fact. I think what this helps Sophie and I also show, though, is that there's a mitigating part in that if you're a highly talented person like an Albright or a Kissinger, there are rules within the American political system that we are able to safely allow people to inhabit, that we are allowed to let people use their talents probably to the same full extent and allow them to make the same significance of contribution to the political system. The second thing they talked about on site government was about normative views on behalf of the United States. And I think when they say that you're American, it doesn't matter where you were born, they're actually missing a very vital point in that the fact that you're American does depend on where you were born in the world. There are some countries, if you you are born there, you will be much more likely to be allowed to be an American. There are some countries where if you were born there and you had relatives who are terrorists, you will be much less likely to be able to be an American. To the same extent, where you were born, these immutable characteristics are relevant to whether you can be president. For all these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
And thank the Leader of the Opposition for remarks. I'll call on the Minister of the Crown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we said it's generally there's been a ridiculous comment on part of side opposition in what we've been really saying. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through my constructive material, which is why citizenship should be the absolute requirement and makes the absolute most sense in a rational way for running for the presidency of the United States, notwithstanding everything we've heard. This also directly clashes with the security points, and I'm going to reference where it clashes throughout that. And then I'm going to get into spirited reputation of the other things that we heard the LO say, and then get into rebuilding my partner's point. So with regard to this security and citizenship idea, right? Just first of all, we'd like to say that if someone's a terrorist, maybe you shouldn't allow them to become an American citizen, right? If those are the sorts of people that we're keeping out, then that's the cutoff point. Once people have become American citizens, we should stop. We should allow them all rights and privileges afforded under that system. What they are arguing for is literally this thing that we got stuff and said, where we should have a second-class citizens. We should have citizens in the country that are granted less rights than other people merely because of this arbitrary cutoff, because they might have been born in another country for a couple of days. And we shouldn't say you came into this country and that sort of thing. Right? We're not talking about foreign workers coming into the country. We're talking about people who we've chosen to make citizens and have devoted a lot of their lives to this sort of thing. That is what they have. That is what they've decided. That's what they've done. This is a nation built on, America is a nation built on immigrants, a nation built on people coming into the country, and we should respect and believe in that ideal and allow people to become whatever they want to become, Mr. Speaker. We should let those people fulfill their dreams, and we shouldn't be oppressing them. Right? Andrew Choat came up here and told you that we're having a discriminatory effect, that these people are arguing about Barack Obama saying he's not American on the news. And you have to understand, Mr. Speaker, that immigrants are watching this. People who immigrate to this country are watching this news channel where they're being told by Fox News and all the people that they aren't people, that they aren't citizens, that they aren't real citizens, that they can't ever run for president, and if they ever tried, and if they ever did, they would be told that they are an inappropriate choice. Right? That citizenship is a qualification for this. If we don't want someone to run for the presidency of the United States because they used to be a terrorist, then we shouldn't let them be a citizen, right? No matter what the other qualifications are. We also shouldn't vote for them, right? Another thing that's been really missed by side opposition is that this is an elected position. We're not talking about a nuclear engineer who's in charge of a nuclear facility. This is a position that's elected, right? These people are chosen by the American people. Someone have to be voted on by a majority of people in a majority of states in order to achieve this position. It isn't something that's some sort of appointment or things like that. We say that there's no greater divided loyalty in these instances. We've heard examples from the Prime Minister about someone born in America and then going elsewhere. We don't think that's an example that's an example that stands in this round at all. They talk about Chinese Americans, but Chinese Americans come in all varieties. Why wouldn't someone who's first generation Chinese was born in America, goes back to China all the time with their parents? Their parents are Chinese. Why would they have any less conflicted loyalty whether or not they were born in China and breathe Chinese air as their first breath? We think that absolutely doesn't make sense. Sure.
So a lot of the security checks we do for high-risk jobs requires us to go through all the documents. We absolutely trust American documents. You cannot trust a partner.
Okay, so that's something that one, voters can take into consideration, and two, there are all sorts of problems with American documents too. Right? I think we've seen this in the case of Barack Obama. We've seen that in the case of anyone else. What we don't know if there's security risk, then we shouldn't grant them citizenship. Right? If we don't know that they're actually secretly a terrorist, that's a point at the citizenship level. That's where that should be dealt with, not through other levels. We think that argument just doesn't hold weight, right? Like, we on the side of government stand for the proposition that loyalty should be tested through service and through votes. That those are the things that matter. That people choose to become citizens of the United States. That's a choice they make, and they show their loyalty through that, and they should be chosen based on that. There's absolutely no difference, and we haven't heard any in this case, about these sorts of issues. There is no divided loyalty. People have these sorts of things. If someone's from British descent, they might have these sorts of issues also. Even if they were to come up here and say the strongest case argument is that there's a crisis in their homeland, they might not be as well suited for it. That could just as easily happen, as we said, with first-generation children of immigrants. It doesn't stand, it doesn't hold water. There's no difference in this case between the two. Okay? So what else did we hear from side opposition? Because there's like rights and like immutable, and then we sort of have these sorts of rights we pick and choose. I think we've already rebutted this in saying that really these sorts of things are already discriminatory. We shouldn't be doing this, that arbitrary cutoffs, that we should be choosing people based on these sorts of choices. And I like that. That's why voters are able to make these types of choices. We see that in Canada, the residency of one of the people of a major political party, Michael Ignatieff, is a voter issue. These are things that can be dealt with at the voter level. We think that's an appropriate place for it. When they talk about these sorts of things, when they talk about that we pick and choose, what we strongly say is that anyone once let in, they should have full rights. They had this third point about reaction rule. They didn't really get to it. I will quickly get to it and talk about this anyway, even if you continue to say it. Right? Like, even if they're going to say this is going to cause riots in the streets, people being murdered, that sort of thing. We said that America has done, for good reasons, just as good things in the past. We've seen Brown versus the Board of Education, with the reintegration of schools. That was the right thing to do. That was a good thing to do. That was a fair thing to do. It was something that caused riots. Sure, it caused people to be injured, but it was the right thing to do. This is the exact same situation. We can deal with this situation. We should deal with this situation. And 50 years past Brown versus the Board of Education, we have a black president in the White House. Right? That makes sense. That's good. That's what we should be looking for. And even if they're going to come up and somehow try and give that argument that they just forgot and dropped the last time, that does not stand. So, looking at the reputation from what Andrew Choat said, with regard to meritocracy, so it's they're not integrated in the whole world. We sort of listen to these marginal cases. We'd say that these are all marginal cases. Everything we have fits in what they classify like a marginal case, because what we're saying is people whose primary loyalty is to the United States of America should be allowed to run. And that doesn't matter if you're born in Guam. It doesn't matter if you're born in Germany like Kissinger. It doesn't matter if you're born in Canada. It doesn't matter if you're born in Austria. What matters is whether or not you have become a citizen and gained the respect of enough other citizens to represent them. We think that all of their analysis about security and that sort of thing also falls out of the round. If someone who's a foreign national could serve as Secretary of State with obviously state secrets in play, when they can serve as Governor of California with obviously huge security issues and those sorts of things, we think that entirely falls out. It doesn't make any sense. Meritocracy, as we discussed, should be the primary feature. This is this idea that morals and safety, we think it doesn't stand. We stand on the idea that people should be competent, the best, and voted in. For these reasons, we're proud to propose.
Thank you, Mr. MacIntyre. And I'm going to call upon the member of the opposition to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Jake and my stance is that the magnitude of possible harms were something, some undesirable national to infiltrate, White House and become president, head of state, that kind of thing. The magnitude of those potential harms is great enough, is significant enough that it's worth drawing a red line, even if it is unlikely to happen, right? So we think that this case is a situation that is not really very relevant in a lot of cases, but we think that the potential harms are so great that it's worth drawing this particular red line. So I want to talk a verify that this person is actually the person you think they are. You have valid documents like birth certificates and that kind of thing. Mr. Speaker, note that even if they spend time abroad, you know what their passport number is, and it's much easier to track and much easier to get information from other governments and that kind of thing. We think it's much more likely if you come from another country that your passport might be fake, that your passport, that your birth certificate might be fake, something like that, and it's just much more difficult to determine who you are and what you've been doing, which is the kind of screening that we want people to go through before they run for this kind of office. So if you can't be sure that you can do the screening properly, you can't be sure that the screening works. Presumably they're also for screening.
But like in this case, we don't screen domestic people. Like that's a voter issue, right? Like if someone's a domestic terrorist son, like he's the one for president.
You actually do screen for this kind of office. You do screen for the highest office in the United States, and that's a good thing. And then, so on this they tell us that voters consider security when they're voting for people. So first of all, Mr. Speaker, I think it's perfectly reasonable to assume that one might be able to fool you. And then also, I don't think a lot of voters are like particularly smart or like qualified to deal with assessment of security risks and that kind of thing. I also want to note that there's an interesting sort of like bit about citizenship where you can be a dual citizen and be in the United States. So the purpose of citizenship is making sure that you always have somewhere to go back to. And if you have dual citizenship, you're not really like bound by the consequences of your actions in the United States insofar as there's another place that has to take you all the time. So we think that that's another check that you would want to have when you are like running for president and that sort of thing. So we think that it's much easier to screen out security risk and not worth it because this job is so important. On this end of the house, they tell us that our distinction doesn't make any sense because a foreign-born person can be the Secretary of State. But Mr. Speaker, the distinction is that the President is responsible for the Secretary of State. Nobody is responsible for the President, and that's really important. Thank you. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about nationalism. So we do think that in a lot of ways, the office of the President represents the national experience of everybody who lives there, the bulk of whom have been born there. And we do think it's positive to have some sort of common experience with the rest of the country, especially during your formative years. And that's what it means to be a citizen who was born in the United States versus naturalized there. So we realize this isn't a perfect measure. You might have someone who was born in the United States, lived there for a little bit, then went somewhere else and came back, and that sort of thing. But if you were born in the United States, it's much more likely that you did go through the education system at some point. You have relatives who live there who can tell you about what the broader, I don't know, social things and social history of the United States are, and that kind of thing. And we do think that it's positive for the highest office in the country to have some sort of experience like that and to guarantee it. So we think that even though it's not a perfect guarantee, we think it's a good start to ensure that this person has some sort of common experience with everybody else. Now I'm going to deal with some reputation. So the first thing they tell us is that it's an issue of meritocracy. And I don't think this really makes much of a difference because there are a lot of people who are we think probably equally qualified to run for the office, right? There's one office, there's an entire country. We think issues of meritocracy maybe matter in more marginal cases, but we actually don't have a problem with putting in place this restriction because we think you still get a good president because there are so many people who we think meet the qualifications to be a good president. Note that we don't really care about meritocracy insofar as we don't find people to run for president who are poor and that kind of stuff. The system isn't perfect, and we don't think the United States totally has a problem with that. So we think that you still get a good president, and that's why meritocracy matters. And meritocracy because you want the best candidate, but we think that there are sufficient people that you will still get a president of equal quality and that kind of thing. Then they tell us that it's discriminatory. Well, Mr. Speaker, we don't think that we have a problem with discriminating on immutable characteristics when the immutable characteristics are relevant to your ability to do your job. And we do think they're relevant to your ability to do your job. Jay gives you this good example of how if you work in very high up security, engineering projects, I guess, your nationality is relevant to your ability to perform your job and keep state secrets and that kind of thing. And we do carry out screening there. So I think that this is the same thing, and we don't think discrimination is bad when it's on immutable characteristics. Immutable characteristics are relevant. So thank you. Then they tell us the last point of constructively about was this idea that immigrants will feel bad, and that immigrants don't like knowing that they can't hold the highest office in life. So first of all, I don't think that, I think this is mitigated by the fact that they can hold other quite high offices, like you can be the governor of California if you're Arnold Schwarzenegger and that kind of stuff. So I don't think there are lots of people who feel meaningfully excluded from the political process just because they can't be president. But moreover, we think that all of already come under the status quo. So what did we tell you, Mr. Speaker? We told you that it's a security issue, and the potential magnitude of harms is great enough that we're willing to use this immutable characteristic to screen you. So on this side of the house, they tell us, well, don't let them immigrate if you think it's possible that you're a terrorist. Mr. Speaker, the point of immigration is not completely thorough, right? Like, we don't want to have to screen to the extent that you would need to screen to make absolutely sure that nobody who comes into the United States could possibly be a terrorist, planning on infiltrating the United States and that sort of thing. We think if there's possibility for failure, the possibility for great harm at this level is also possible. Then we tell you that we don't think you have absolute rights as an immigrant because the state can decide not to accept you. We don't think we heard a significant response to that. And finally, they tell us voters deal with reaction. It's possible for some a majority of people to support a candidate and a small minority to be very, very angry about it. So we think that our outcomes are better as well.
Great. I'd like to thank the members of the opposition for remarks on the leader of the opposition. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So, I'm actually not sure, but on the face of this case, it seems like it's about more than just opening one job up to more people. Because if they were to believe that you ought to open the job of the presidency up, then they should also believe that you ought to open a lot of other jobs up to other people. Or if it's not that, then I think it's a case about letting less people into the country. But in either of these states of the world, I think Sophie and I will win in this case. I want to talk about three areas of clash. The first is the preferences of the American people. The second is about immutable characteristics. And the third is about verificability. So, on the American people, I think we have both agreed on both sides of the house that the American people both want a president who they can relate to from their earliest experiences and factually just distrust and cloud the political process when there is a president who they do not trust. But why does this matter on a practical level rather than just being an artifact of the Constitution? Sophie and I have brought to you the idea that the president is a communicator to the American people and needs that trust to do their function effectively. And in the status, and when that doesn't exist, they're a bad president. So that's why the preferences of the American people. Secondly, on immutable characteristics. So I think we would accept that meritocracy is the right way to choose a president. One aspect of meritocracy is how qualified you are to do the job. One qualification of doing the job of the presidency is how much you can elicit trust from people, and to that extent it matters who you are. And secondly, to what extent you can prove your credentials, because Sophie brings up the excellent point that you cannot prove your passport is the same authenticity as an American passport that was issued by the American government over which it has absolute control. And in the same way, the ability to verify, right, isn't simply who the voters elect, Mr. Speaker. There are obviously background checks done on the president. We just don't think that voters are qualified to actually look up whether someone who was born in a different country is or is not a security risk to the American people. Right. So, what does this come down to? I think if they accept all of our arguments that you need to screen and they would prefer allowing less people into the country, then Sophie and I win because we give you a world where we allow immigration to occur, and that is a much greater good than allowing one job to be literally that one job to be open to immigrants. We think that's much greater. If it's you allow people in and you just claim that you can screen for them, Sophie and I show you ample reasons why simply allowing voters to look at documents that are not American in origin place the country at risk, because the checks and balances are not sufficient once someone is in office. And for all of those reasons, we're proud to oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the leader of the opposition. I'll call upon the Prime Minister to
big questions bouncing around, and one fairly ridiculous opposition to our case that we need to deconstruct. So the first question is whether or not, like, which country we were born is a valid way of screening. Sorry, let me just begin. So there's one massive box that we get, right? It's the Manchurian candidate opposition, the idea that someone can actually infiltrate the US presidency and pose a threat. You actually think that that can happen, I think, I'm sorry. If you actually think that that can happen, that can be deconstructed quite thoroughly. The second issue is the straw man, which is, oh, well, they're arguing that we should basically allow, like, we should open up every job and, like, reduce the level of screening because we can't screen effectively and we let people become the presidents who are born in countries we think are dangerous, and we have to let those people into jobs that are high risk as well. So we can take that down. So the first question is whether or not this immutable characteristic is a relevant thing for blocking your access to the presidency, regardless of whether it's relevant to your citizenship. Like this. And the second question is, like, basically, can this Manchurian kind of, like, scenario ever arise that, like, people have to do, like, even if, right? And the third question is, like, what effect does this have on the public? How important is trust? Can you trust someone who wasn't born in states? Like, to go through it, right? So I think that's the argument that you have to screen people before they can hold these high-risk jobs. Like, you say, look, okay, the argument about whether or not just due to the fact you were born in one country means that we shouldn't let you immigrate is a separate argument. Certainly, we would say maybe that bears evaluation. Maybe if your screening process is not good enough to detect people who might be terrorists, you should improve your screening process. The point is, like, if you really, really want to argue that maybe some countries we shouldn't let people immigrate from, okay, that's separate. We understand with no, like, directly oppose that. The point is, once you decided that someone is a citizen and accorded them the rights accorded to an American citizen, then the issue becomes that we should allow them to run for the presidency. They're separate. We're not saying that you should get rid of them. You should let every Republican president become, like, you know, enter these jobs, right? Or we are actually, but the selection is made at an earlier level than the presidential election. We think that's ridiculous. After all, they're telling what if a really bad foreigner dedicates a huge portion of their life to, like, sneaking around our checks, immigrating to the States, becoming a citizen, like, infiltrating the ranks of one of the political parties, being elected, and being there. We say a couple of things. First of all, it's totally valid for them to become the Secretary of State who has access to just as much sensitive information and stuff like that. So who's responsible? Well, look, the President is responsible for the Secretary of State. No one's responsible for the President. If you could persuade the President to make you the Secretary of State, you can probably persuade people to elect you as president, right? Like, if you are not capable of being elected as president, you're not capable of basically becoming Secretary of State. The thing is that, like, we've had many foreign secretaries of state, and what they're proposing has never happened. Foreigners have long held really high posts in American government, and this has never been a problem. Obama wasn't born abroad, but spent a lot of time abroad. Like, he hasn't been a problem to national security in that respect. This is absolutely ridiculous. It's totally unfeasible. I shouldn't even have to refute it, right? Like, the fact of the matter is the security check is just as valid in both. What about trust? The argument, like, well, if the president isn't a communicator, if he doesn't share broad values of the community, then people won't trust him. If people can't trust him, then he or she will not be elected. If it's an entirely separate issue and not allowed us to do our